you like me to start?
Hello, everyone. Shall we start?
Yes. Shall I share my screen?
If you want, if that's okay with you.
Yes, of course. Now, I'm hoping you can see that. Can you see the screen?
Yes.
Thank you. Let me see if I can. Good. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to speak to you. It's a great pleasure and honor to be able to do so. Um, present an abstract theoretical account of how we make sense of the world and how we make choices and decisions. This is largely for fun. It's largely a very high level discussion, so you don't have to remember any of this. And I'm hoping that I will be able to get through it quickly so that we can have questions and answers at the end. Most of the things that I'm going to talk about were established by people like Helmholtz in the 19th century, and in particular, taking forward the work of Helmholtz by people like Geoffrey Hinton. So I'm going to start by showing you a response by Geoffrey Hinton to a question that he was asked after he accepted his Ulysses Medal in California a few years ago. So I got a YouTube clip of his response. If you can't hear it, tell me and I will read out what he said. But what I want to do is basically set the scene for the importance of Helmholtz's contributions that I will then unpack in the rest of the talk. So at the end of his presentation, Geoffrey Hinton was asked if you could go back in time and meet one of your intellectual heroes, who would you like to meet? And this was his response.
No sound. Professor, we cannot hear now.
Right. I will speak over him. In fact, I will pause him. If I can. I will read out what Jeff was saying. So what he said was, I'd like to meet Helmholtz. And Helmholtz believed in unconscious perceptual inference. He thought that vision involved many inferences. One infers the proximal stimulus, the state of the world that generated it. And another aspect of Helmholtz's work concerned free energy. And what he didn't know was that to infer a complex model, a statistician would advise you to do the inference by determining the best way for your model to explain the data. And a model could have multiple ways of explaining the data, and you need to determine the probability of each of these ways. And that variational inference approximates the probabilities while ensuring model improvement. And then thus, the two completely different aspects of Helmholtz's work, namely free energy and perceptual inference, are closely related. And free energy is the key to perceptual inference. And I'd like to tell Helmholtz this. And then the audience applauds with rapture, and then he leaves the stage. So that was quite complicated, but what I'm going to do for the next 40 minutes is try to unpack what Geoffrey Hinton was trying to say and to foreground the importance of Helmholtz's work. And I'm going to do it by telling two stories. The first story is about how we work, how we self-organize from the point of view of physics, with a special emphasis on something called Markov blankets and the Bayesian mechanics that arise in virtue of these Markov blankets that effectively enable you to discriminate between self and non-self, or an observer and the observed. And then I'm going to repeat the story, but using the words that you will find in cognitive neuroscience and psychology and medicine, a more intuitive understanding of the statistics of life and self-organization of the kind that you would find in, for example, psychology, focusing on things like predictive coding and how they are implemented in neuronal networks. And then if we have time, I'd like to turn to action and perception and different kinds of action and the implicit agency, and just ask what is different between things like you and me and other things like thermostats or viruses that still can respond to their environment but don't have certain aspects of their capacity to plan and engage in intentional behavior. So I'm going to start with a question posed by Schrödinger. How can the events in space and time which take place within the spatial boundary of a living organism be accounted for by physics and chemistry? Now, we are not going to answer that question, but what we do want to do is just focus on the notion of a spatial boundary. And that's important because if we want to talk about anything, a particle or a population or a person or a cell, we have to be able to individuate that thing, that self, that observer from everything else. And the way that I'm going to do that is to introduce this notion of a Markov blanket. So for those of you not familiar with a Markov blanket, sometimes called a Markov boundary, I've drawn this picture here where all of these small cyan circles correspond to some state of the universe in a very abstract way. And the arrows or the edges denote an influence of this state on this state. And if I now identify some states that are internal to the thing or the self in question, say my internal states, then the Markov blanket states comprise the parents, the children, and the parents of the children. And you may be asking, what's important about these particular states? Well, the idea here is that if I wanted to know how my internal states were going to change over time, given the rest of the universe, then I'd only need to know my blanket states. So mathematically, what this means is that my internal dynamics are conditionally independent of the external dynamics that are hidden behind the Markov blanket if I knew my Markov blanket. So I only need to know the states of the Markov blanket in order to determine how my internal states are going to change. And I'm going to make a further move here. I'm going to divide the blanket states into active states that influence but are not influenced by the internal states and sensory states, and active states that influence but are not influenced by the external states. And I'll try and explain why I'm doing that in the next slide. But at the moment, we've got a partition of states that can define me or a particle, namely particular states, in terms of the internal states of that person or that particle that are surrounded or shielded from the rest of the universe with the blanket states that are divided into sensory and active states. So my favorite example, and I suspect yours at medical school as well, of a system would be the brain. And we can regard all the internal states of the brain, all the neuronal activity, all the connectivity, all the physiological states of the brain as internal to the brain. And on that view, the active states now become my actuators, my neuromuscular junctions, my autonomic reflexes. And then these active states influence the outside. It could be my body, it could be my physiology, it could be extrapersonal space, moving things around in the world beyond my sensory, my Markov blanket. And then these external states influence my sensory states, my sensory epithelia, my retina, all my sense organs that then change the internal states. So this partition affords a picture of a action perception cycle where the inside is influencing the outside through the active states, and then the outside is influencing the inside through the sensory states. So that the sensory states are both separate from, but deeply coupled in this circular fashion to the external state. So the brain is open to the environment or to the lived world. What I want to do now is to ask you to forget about the Markov blanket for a while. What we're going to do is some physics, some basic physics, and then put the Markov blanket back into play to understand the special kind of mechanics that emerge when you have this separation of self from non-self. So the physics that I want to talk about is all based upon something called a random dynamical system. For those of you who've done physics recently, you may recognize this as a Langevin equation. All we're saying is that there are some states of the world that change in time, and that's what the dot means, in a lawful way, in a function of where you are in some state space, plus some random fluctuations. And I've drawn a little picture of some two-dimensional state space here. It could represent any aspect of me at any temporal scale. So it could be electrochemical oscillations in a single cell in my brain. It could be phases of my cardiac cycle. It could be me getting up in the morning, having a cup of coffee, doing my emails. It doesn't matter what scale we're coarse graining or defining or looking at this system. The same law applies simply because I have some characteristic states of being. I have to go back to states that I was once in. So necessarily we have this itinerant trajectory, sometimes called an attractor or a pullback attractor, that basically is limited to a small number of states that are characteristic of the kind of thing that I am. And I'm not going to be found in lots of other states that will preclude me existing as the natural kind that I am. And that affords an interesting interpretation. It means I can interpret these set of attracting states, these characteristic states that characterize me, in terms of the probability that you will find me in any one state if you sampled me at any time at random. And that's useful because in physics we know a lot about how this probability density itself changes with time. And I've described that here in terms of something called the Fokker-Planck equation. It's also known as the Schrödinger wave equation or the master equation. We don't have to worry about the functional form or the mathematics, just that there is a lawful description of the rate of change of this probability density. And more interestingly, there is a solution to this equation, which means that I can always express the flow of states through this state space, the dynamics, say the neuronal dynamics or physiological dynamics, as a function of the amplitude of the random fluctuations, gamma, and the log of the probability of finding me in a particular state x. And this is a gradient operator, which means that I can always describe the flow of anything that has characteristic states as if it was climbing up probability gradients, gathering itself together to resist the dispersion into the states that do not characterize the thing in question, namely to resist the dispersion that or dissipation that underwrites the second law of thermodynamics. More intuitively, and you'll notice that there was this cue here. There's a dissipative part which is driven by the random fluctuations, and a non-dissipative part, which is this sometimes called a solenoidal or curl flow that goes around the isocontours of these probability densities. And we will all be familiar with that when we're watching water flowing down the plug hole. So the flowing down the plug hole would be the gradient, the dissipative part, and then going round in circles would be the solenoidal part. I emphasize this because it's an important aspect of any biological self-organization. Wherever you find biological self-organization, you'll find this solenoidal oscillatory-like dynamics, whether it is oscillations, gamma oscillations in my hippocampus, through to cardiac cycles, through to life cycles, right through to replication and reproduction at evolutionary timescales. You'll always find this circular kind of activity. But what about the Markov blanket? Well, what I've just said applies to all the states, including the internal states and the external states and the blanket states. And by construction, the dynamics of the internal states and the active states are not a function of the external states, which means I can write down the solution to the density dynamics. And I should say this solution is due to something called the Helmholtz decomposition, which is why Helmholtz figures so much in this story. I can write down these dynamics in terms of the internal states and the active states. And the story I'm going to tell is that that is a mathematical picture of perception and action in a very general sense. And it will look as if both the internal states and the active states are trying to increase this log probability. So how can we interpret this log probability? Well, I've just said that these states, in this instance, the sensory states of my Markov blanket, are those that are characteristic of me. They have meaning and value for me because these are the states that characterize or define me as the thing that I am. And therefore, we can interpret this as dynamics that are trying to maximize value. And from that, we can relate to stories or narratives of reinforcement learning. If you were an engineer, this would be a statement of optimal control theory. And if you're an economist, it would be expected utility theory. Interestingly, the negative of this kind of value, this log probability of characteristic or preferred or attracting states, is known as self-information in information theory, also known as surprisal, or more simply surprise. And this leads to a formulation in terms of information theory, such as the principle of maximum mutual information, the Informax principle, and also principles of minimum redundancy and maximum efficiency, and of course the free energy principle itself. Why the free energy principle? Well, the free energy is just a construction that provides a bound approximation to this self-information or surprise. It measures the surprise, and we'll find out the particular benefits of using free energy as opposed to surprise later on. But at the moment, it's also interesting to note that the average surprise or self-information is entropy, which means it looks as though the internal and the active states are trying to minimize, on average, entropy. And of course, that is the holy grail of things like self-organization in physics and synergetics. And if you're a physiologist, this is just a statement of homeostasis. It's a description of things that keep their essential variables within viable ranges. They're resisting the dissipation due to random fluctuations. So, for example, to keep my temperature within bounds. There's a fourth interpretation of this quantity, which a statistician would bring to the table. So she would say, oh, well, this is just simply the probability of some sensory data given me as a model of those data. And in statistics, that's known as the moral evidence, also known as the marginal likelihood. Why marginal? Well, because you're marginalizing over all the hidden causes of your sensory input, namely the external states, because they're hidden behind the Markov blanket. So that means we can also interpret this action perception, according to this Helmholtz decomposition, as maximizing the evidence for me as a model of the causes of my sensations. And this is closely related to the Bayesian brain hypothesis. You often come across formulations in terms of evidence accumulation, and a popular implementation of this, sometimes called self-evidencing, is predictive coding, which we'll focus on in a moment. So we've done all the heavy lifting now from the point of view of the maths. What I want to do now is tell you the same story, but now using words and intuitions which I'm hoping that you will be much more familiar with. But the end point, the conclusion is exactly the same. It's looking at the fundamental principles of self-organization and self-maintenance cast in terms of this self-evidencing or Bayesian brain perspective on self-organization. So the story here probably could be traced back to the students of Plato through Kant. I'm choosing to start in the 16th century with this oil painter famed for painting still lives, bowls of fruit, for example, that when viewed from a different perspective, from a different angle, give you a very different visual impression. So if you saw a bowl of fruit and now you see a face, the point being made here is that you made that face. This is something that you brought to the table as an explanation that most simply explains this particular pattern of sensory inputs. And this idea, I think, was most beautifully articulated by Helmholtz himself. So, for example, objects are always imagined as being present in the field of vision, as would have to be there in order to produce the same impression on the nervous mechanism. So again, what it's saying is that to perceive, to recognize, to see something is to already have it on the inside, such that it provides an inference to the best explanation, or in his words, an act of unconscious inference, that you're explaining the sensations in terms of what caused them. And this idea is very closely related to theories in the 20th century in psychology, for example, Richard Gregory's notion of perception as hypothesis testing, again, emphasizing the fact that perception is really the confirmation of best guesses, perceptions, fantasies, explanations, hypotheses that are the best explanation for your sensory data. And these ideas were used by Geoffrey Hinton and colleagues such as Peter Dayan to build a Helmholtz machine. And they actually built a Helmholtz machine in machine learning as a metaphor for the Bayesian brain, borrowing from Bayesian probability theory, and in particular, the work of Richard Feynman, who invented, in the context of quantum electrodynamics, this variational free energy that provides a tractable measure of the surprise or the surprisal or self-information that we want to describe as being minimized. But let's come back to this, Helmholtz's notion of impressions on the nervous system. So from the point of view of this talk, what we're saying is that there is something out there beyond our skull-bound brains that is causing sensory impressions on our Markov blanket. And if we are self-evidencing, we're going to try to find an explanation that accounts for this sensory impression on our sensory blankets or our sensory veil. So, for example, is this a bird or is it a leaf? We will never know, but we can have explanations as to what could have caused this shadow or impression on our sensory blanket. So how can the brain do that? Well, we already know how it does that because it has to be described in terms of this Helmholtz decomposition. So what I've done here is just write down this fundamental solution to all density dynamics that anything that maintains itself in characteristic states must comply with. What I've done here is replace the value or the log probability of characteristic states with the free energy. And I've also written it in a way that if you were an engineer, you'd recognize there's something called a Kalman filter. And more recently in neuroscience, this has become popular or understood in terms of predictive coding. So what do I mean by that? Well, one can rearrange this equation, this Helmholtz decomposition for the internal states into this solenoidal or non-dissipative part, which can be regarded as a prediction. So why can it be regarded as a prediction? Well, if I imagine that my state of the brain parameterizes some belief about the causes of my sensations in the outside, the external states, then I know how these states or these expectations will change with time. So I can predict what I will see in the next instant of time. But when I actually get some sensory information, I can now augment or update that prediction with this. And this is the dissipative part, and it's the part that does the gradient flow. And the gradient just is a prediction error. So the gradients of the free energy are just prediction errors. So what's a prediction error? Well, imagine I had this sensory impression on my retina, and my internal brain states were encoding a Bayesian belief, an expectation that this could be explained by a howling dog. And if I had a generative model that could generate or predict what I would see, if this expectation or hypothesis was correct, then I can simply subtract my prediction from what I'm actually sensing, and the difference, the mismatch, is just the prediction error. And all this equation is saying is that this prediction error will drive my neuronal dynamics, encoding an expectation or representation of the causes of my sensations until the prediction error is minimized. And then I've got a good enough explanation for this particular cause of my sensory input. But note, I will never know what actually caused my sensory input. In this example, it wasn't a dog, it was a little cat. But I don't care. As long as I can keep my prediction errors small throughout my life, then that's good enough for me in terms of providing a good enough explanation, inference to the best explanation of my sensorium. So this notion of prediction error as a gradient of free energy, which we can minimize or eliminate by finding the minimum of free energy, I think is very nice, because we can forget about all of the physics and just summarize the imperatives for both action and perception in terms of trying to resolve prediction errors. And we can do that in one of two ways. I can actually literally change my mind by changing my neural activity to make my predictions more like the sensations, and we can associate that with perception. But there is another way of reducing the prediction error. I can make my sensations more like the predictions. So how would I do that? Well, simply by moving, simply by sampling the world in a different way to get a new set of sensations that are closer to what I predicted I would sample. So on that view, action becomes a fulfillment of predictions. Everything that we do in terms of moving our eyes and our bodies, and also you could argue autonomically in terms of engaging our autonomic reflexes, is simply to comply with the way that we predict that we will act and subsequently sense and sample the world. So I've given a neurobiological example here just to illustrate the relationship between action and perception, and also unpack these ideas from the point of view of neuroanatomy, for example. Almost universally, the kinds of generative models we're talking about have a deep hierarchical structure, and I'll try to explain what I mean by that. Let's take, for example, visual input from the retina. It comes down the optic nerves and arrives at the lateral geniculate nucleus, and it is in receipt of top-down predictions from the visual cortex, and therefore one can compare the actual input with the predicted input to form a prediction error, usually associated with the neuronal activity of superficial pyramidal cell populations. And then this prediction error, according to this Helmholtz decomposition, is then sent back up to the visual cortex to drive the encoding of external states or hidden states so that the prediction error is eliminated. and that encoding is usually associated with deep pyramidal cells in the deeper layers of the cortex. But notice these expectations now can themselves be predicted in the hierarchical or deep level, meaning that this now is a secondary prediction error, which is the difference between what is being encoded here and what one would predict from the point of view of a higher level. And then this secondary prediction error will be passed forward higher up the hierarchy to revise these implicit Bayesian beliefs or expectations until you've resolved prediction error at every level of a hierarchical representation. And this resolution depends upon physiologically and anatomically plausible reciprocal or recurrent connections where you've got these descending predictions from higher to lower levels of cortical hierarchies that are in the opposite direction from the ascending counterstream of prediction errors. And exactly the same can be applied to proprioceptive prediction errors, namely the prediction errors that arise in the systems reporting the state of my body in terms of muscular stretch receptors, for example. So let's assume that we've got some proprioceptive input from the oculomotor system. It comes into the pontine nuclei. It is in receipt of or compared to top-down predictions, say from the frontal eye fields, vicariously, to form a prediction error. And now we could use that prediction error to update our beliefs about where our eye is pointing. But there's a much simpler way of resolving these proprioceptive prediction errors, and that's to send them back out into the periphery, into the peripheral nervous system, to the neuromuscular junctions, to cause the muscles to contract so that the proprioceptive responses are what we predicted. And what I've just described is, of course, just a classical reflex arc. So now the top-down predictions now serve the role of setting the fixed point for reflexes, and they can be homeostatic in the autonomic system, or they can be the set points or the equilibrium points for motor control with striated muscle. So notice that this is exactly what we predict in terms of active states, trying to minimize free energy or prediction error, but it's also just a statement or a description of what we know to be true in the way that our bodies actually work. And also note, when we say we're acting to fulfill predictions, we don't mean predictions everywhere, only in those modalities that they're easy to fulfill, such as in the proprioceptive modality. So this is very much like a sort of closed loop control of a reflexive sort, but is deeply informed by an open loop hierarchical assimilation of all sorts of other information, interoceptive and exteroceptive. So I'll close now by asking a question. Is that construction, is that sort of coarse-grained description of functional brain architectures sufficient to describe action and agency? And you could argue, yes, you can get quite a long way simulating these kinds of dynamics and reproduce lots of quite plausible behavior that we study in neuroscience and cognitive neuroscience and electrophysiology. So I'm showing you one of my favorite examples here. It's a very early example. So what we did is we equipped a synthetic agent with a very abstract generative model based upon a heteroclinic cycle. You can think of this as a sort of central pattern generator. And this generative model for this agent entailed a mapping from these unstable fixed points of the central pattern generator to points, physical points in extrapersonal space. And furthermore, the generative model or the agent thinks that its finger is attached to the invisible point that's moving around with an invisible spring. So the agent predicts that it will both feel and see its finger being pulled around in a systematic way, here engineered to reproduce handwriting-like movements. And because the agent predicts that it will feel proprioceptively its finger moving, its reflexes will cause the finger to move to eliminate the prediction errors. And in doing that, it will generate the visual sensations that were predicted on the basis of this generative model. So effectively, this agent is creating its own sensorium. It's authoring its own causal structure in the world by reflexively fulfilling predictions and then registering them in the visual modality. And on this view, we can look at the descending predictions in the proprioceptive domain as motor commands and the corollary discharge of the visual predictions. And you can do all sorts of interesting things with these simulations. Here, I'm just plotting the activity of one of these units as a function of where the finger is in space. And one can reproduce things like place cell activity, characteristic receptive field responses like direction selectivity. It likes the downstroke of this letter, but not the upstroke. And even more interestingly, what we can do is remove the proprioceptive prediction errors. So from the agent's point of view, it's as though they're seeing handwriting, but they cannot feel it, which means that it will be like looking at somebody else doing the same action. And because the agent has a perfectly apt generative model to explain the visual input, the agent can use exactly the same generative model to explain the visual input, which means that we can look at this as a simulation of action and action observation using exactly the same neuronal machinery or generative model as a metaphor for the mirror neuron system. So is that good enough to explain how we how we move and how we choose to engage with the world? I think most people would argue no. You know, the thing that we do, we actually think ahead, we plan, we have intentions. So how could we possibly explain that kind of that physics that would underlie true or authentic agency, where we're actually selecting among a number of different ways forward? And from the physicist's point of view, it's actually very, very simple. All I'm going to do is to go back to our Markov blanket construction, and I'm just going to remove this influence of the active states on the internal states. And the reason for that is that I want to model now what would it look like if I was dealing with something that was very, very big, and so big that the internal states now become sequestered or separated from the active states. In other words, the internal states can no longer be influenced by the active states. And that's important because we know that we can always interpret the internal states as inferring the causes of the sensory states. But now the active states become a cause of the sensory states. So it would look as if the brains of large things like you and me were actually inferring our own actions. And in engineering, this is known as planning as inference. So not only are we acting, but we're actually inferring, what am I doing at the moment? And then predicting what we'd feel if I inferred I was doing that. And that leads to a really interesting notion that now the interpretation of the neuronal representations of the causes of my sensations now includes my own action. And that means I now have to work out the surprisal or its free energy bound that is appropriate for the consequences of my own action that crucially are in the future. So now I have to have an expected free energy, or a free energy that I would expect if I did that. And that brings me to the sort of mechanics or the technical part of unpacking the imperatives implicit in this kind of active inference or planning as inference, where we are now very much future pointing. Our generative models entail the consequences of our actions in the future. So I've now written the full expression for the free energy and the expected free energy. If you don't like equations, don't worry about this. I'm only showing the equations just to try to unpack them more intuitively and in terms of things that you will already recognize and indeed may have had lectures about. So let's just take the functional, the variational free energy that underwrites perception and sense making. And I've said before, basically, it's a bound approximation to the model evidence or the log probability or preferred states that are characteristic of me. And it's a bound approximation because all I'm doing is taking this quantity, this value, if you like, that I want to maximize, or the negative that I want to minimize as surprise or self-information, and equipping it with something that can never be less than zero. It's a divergence or a difference measure that can never be less than zero, in the same spirit or sense that a distance can't be negative. And so I can construct this, and I can actually measure this very easily. I can construct this band just by adding a KL divergence to this log evidence here. And in machine learning, this is known as an evidence bound, sometimes abbreviated as an elbow or evidence lower bound. If you're a statistician, you may find it easier to interpret this free energy in terms of complexity and accuracy. So I can just switch the terms around and express it as accuracy, the degree of fit that my predictions have in relation to my sensory data, minus the complexity. So what's the complexity? Well, it's just the difference. It's just a KL divergence between my posterior beliefs after seeing some data relative to my prior beliefs. So it just measures how much I've changed my mind when I see something, when I have some sensory data to accommodate that's going to cause my Bayesian belief updating from my prior beliefs to my posterior beliefs. That's called complexity in statistics, and normally we're trying to minimize that to minimize the free energy. So we're trying to find the simplest account that preserves the accuracy of my explanation for these data. But the really interesting thing comes when I now realize that data in the future, consequent upon action, now is a random variable. So I now have to take the average of the complexity and the accuracy or the divergence and the log evidence under what I expect to observe if I did this or committed to a particular action here. And in that setting, the complexity or the expected complexity becomes risk, the expected inaccuracy becomes ambiguity, and the expectations of divergence and log evidence become intrinsic and extrinsic value, respectively. So, what do these terms mean? Well, you will know what they mean, but I'll try and clarify that intuitively just by picking out certain combinations of these quantities and highlighting what they mean for motivated behavior, for our intentions. Let's first of all assume that my states can take any form. I have no prior preferences or expectations about any particular state. I don't mind what I sense. Then I'm just left with this, the expected divergence. What is this? Well, it's known by many names. Mathematically, it's basically the difference between my beliefs about the causes of my sensations, the external states, given the sensory information, relative to the absence of that information consequent upon acting. So it scores the amount to which getting this information, if I did that, would change my beliefs about the causes of my sensations, the states of affairs of the world beyond my Markov blanket. So it scores the resolution of uncertainty, also known as the expected information gain. It's also known as Bayesian surprise in the visual search literature. Mathematically, it's just the mutual information between the cause and consequence, the external causes of the sensory consequences that I can actually observe. It's also got lots of other names. In robotics, it's known as intrinsic motivation. It's the thing that underwrites exploration, sometimes known as epistemic value or the things that underwrite epistemic affordances. It's the information-seeking part of our the imperatives for our intentional behavior. Let me now take a certain uncertainty off the table. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pretend that I can see all the external states of the world. I've got so many sensory samples and organs and receptors that I can sense everything. So the S is the sensations, and the hidden states or the external states become the same thing. So there's no ambiguity. I'm just left with another KR divergence that this time I want to minimize. And this minimization is basically minimizing the difference between what I anticipate I will encounter if I do action A relative to my prior preferences. So this is basically in engineering called path integral control, or KL control. In economics, it's risk-sensitive control. It's basically acting in a way that I think that the outcomes will be as close as possible to my preferred characteristic states of being. And then finally, if I remove all uncertainty that can be reduced through behavior, I'm just left with the extrinsic value, those states that a priori I prefer, that are characteristic of me. And of course, that's just things like expected utility theory. So I'll just close with a numerical example of the kind of behavior that emerges when you have this planning as inference, this active inference predicated on minimizing expected free energy, namely a mixture of expected information gain and expected value, trying to maximize both of those things. And I'm going to illustrate it through the lens of these of visual search and salience, where the salience of looking over there or looking over there is just the information gain or the resolution of uncertainty I think will be afforded if I committed to looking over here as opposed to looking over here. And we can compute that mathematically. So, for example, if I was only allowed to sample this little portion of a visual image, how much information would I get about what image am I sampling? Is it this scene I am sampling? And I can move the circle around and work out the intrinsic value or the salience, the negative expected free energy, and then plot out a salience map. And indeed, when I do that, I do actually identify those parts of the image to which visual saccades are attracted in human subjects. And this comes from the classic work of Jarbas. And we can simulate that, again, creating a synthetic agent who has a very simple world. In her world, she can be looking at an upright face, a sideways face, or an inverted face, but she can only sample it by looking carefully at little portions of the scene, or the face in this instance, denoted by these red circles here. So this is what she actually senses or samples with the sensory organ, with the eye in this case, but has to choose very carefully the actions or the policies that will resolve the greatest amount of uncertainty about the orientation of what she is looking at. And this is where she chooses to look for the most disambiguating locations. These are the salience maps, or the expected information gain that changes as her beliefs or expectations are informed by successive saccadic palpitations. This is what she's sampling. And these are the internal beliefs encoded by the internal neuronal activity, correctly inferring that she is actually looking at an upright face. So I'm going to summarize what I've been saying for the past 10, 20 minutes in a much more concise way, using, again, the words of Helmholtz. Each movement we make by which we alter the appearance of objects should be thought of as an experiment designed to test whether we have understood correctly the invariant relations of the phenomena before us. That is, their existence in definite spatial relations. And with that, it only remains for me to thank those people whose ideas I've been talking about, but of course, to thank you for your attention. Thank you very much.
Thank Thank you so much, Professor, for your fascinating presentation. It's a great privilege to have you here as our esteemed guest. Would you mind having some questions?
No, I would love some questions.
Okay,
Ah,
then we will now begin the Q&A session, and we would love it to be as interactive as possible. So please feel free to type your questions or contributions in the chat box, and we will address as many of them as possible during our interactive Q&A session. You can also raise your hands if you want to address the question yourself.
Yeah. Can I ask a question, please?
Sure.
Hi, Mr. Professor Friston. It's my pleasure. It's my pleasure to join your conference. When I was in postdoc years, and I worked with the Professor Walter Freeman and Professor Robert Kozma, and I am wondering about that. In phase transition conditions during the beta gamma transitions, and then the Markov blanket conditions, can Markov blanket conditions change or still remain in the laws? And I'm just wondering that. And also in the predictive error entropy, can we find an entropy doubling property by the Professor Terence Tao introduced to the double entropy? And is it possible to see those properties in the model? Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Nice to see you. And yes, it is very good that you've introduced Walter Freeman. In fact, one of the very earliest descriptions of the predictive coding implementation of this was actually written in honor of Walter Freeman. I think it's called Attractors in Song. So we basically had simulations of a bird that was singing a song, but crucially, the generative model had two parts to it, and both parts, or two levels, were based on Lorentz attractors. And crucially, there was a separation temporal scale. So the slow attractor changed the parameters of the lower attractor to induce bifurcations to generate realistic song. And the maths works perfectly okay. So you can just put predictive coding in the context of this attractor view and nonlinear dynamical systems view of neuronal representation. Interestingly, in response to the second half of your question, because it is so nonlinear, it has to be nonlinear in order to get the sort of the attractors and the bifurcations into either the deterministic or the chaotic or the stochastic chaos. When you're simulating the internal dynamics, you're normally doing it in terms of the average population activity. So that's usually deterministic, even if the sensory input can be slightly stochastic. The inversion of it is usually written as a deterministic gradient flow, which can have these chaotic aspects and can have these bifurcations. So certainly you can simulate just using exactly that gradient flow, that Helmholtz decomposition expressed as predictive coding, but crucially under highly nonlinear generative model that has the opportunity for bifurcations. And then those nonlinearities will therefore induce very non-Gaussian distributions to the predictions and to what's going on. So it doesn't you don't address the sort of the sort of generalization of entropy that would ensue from non-Gaussian assumptions directly. What you do is you put them in the nonlinearities in various mappings, so that almost simply through a substitution of variables, for example, the thing you are predicting now becomes highly non-Gaussian and will have appropriate entropic measures with sort of heavy-tailed aspects. But so yeah, absolutely. All of this really is predicated on some of the fundamental ideas that Walter Freeman brought to the table. And just to make that point very, very clear, every simulation that we've ever published using this technology, and in particular this Helmholtz foundation for predictive coding schemes, they have all started with an attractor that has the capacity to show bifurcations. If you use something with a fixed point attractor, you just wouldn't be able to simulate anything of biological meaning whatsoever. So you have to have the phase transitions, or at least have the itinerancy associated with chaotic systems to generate the solenoidal, biologically biomimetic kind of dynamics.
Thank you very much. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
We have a question in the chat box from İrem Koçak. She asks, Professor Friston, given the transition from Freud's psychic energy to your variational free energy, how can we develop a robust empirical methodology to measure these economic flows in the brain during the psychoanalytic process? What is the future of computational neuropsychoanalysis in the terms of measurement?
Right, well, that's a very, again, an excellent question. So that there are two communities looking at that issue. One is the the neuropsychoanalysis community, spearheaded by, or some of the key architects of which would be people like Mark Soames and Panksepp, although he now has unfortunately passed. And they are taking the fundaments of active inference, and in particular, focusing on the importance of what I didn't emphasize in the presentation, but was part of that free energy gradient cast as a prediction error, which is the precision of the prediction error. So the degree to which the prediction errors will drive dynamics at higher levels in a generative model depends upon their precision. It depends effectively on their signal to noise, if you like, or the credence that you afford different prediction errors. Just as a note, in the philosophy literature, you will often come across the notion of a precision-weighted prediction error. So a lot of the work in computational psychiatry, which is the other field, and neuropsychoanalysis focuses on the modulation or the weighting of precision under the assumption that the variational free energy is the direct homologue of Freudian free energy, and that sort of trying to understanding the Freudian free energy from a sort of physics perspective using Feynman's variational free energy basically means how do you equip certain representations with the ability to influence others or suppress others. And that usually is cast in terms of this, as I say, this precision weighting, translates in terms of things like sensory attenuation at the sensory level, right through to understanding people's convictions and prior beliefs about the way that they interact with the world as a person, as unduly precise prior beliefs, for example. So that's how you would, I think, understand mechanistically psychoanalytic approaches to sense making and self-modeling and understanding and planning the way that you interact with others. In terms of measuring it, what that normally boils down to are measures of the precision or the complexity of the neuronal responses that depend upon the precision of the message passing and the predictive coding. And that can usually be expressed or usually be accessed in using classical paradigms like the mismatch negativity. So that if you think about the active inference and free energy minimization as basically being able to minimize surprise, that tells you immediately you have to be able to be surprised. So you can now measure the degree to which people can recognize things in using oddball paradigms by presenting surprising stimuli using things like the mismatch negativity paradigm, and then use that in a psychiatric context to try and evaluate how different people respond to surprising events and how quickly they learn about those things, and you can sort of measure that in terms of the amplitude of EEG responses or their statistics. So normally you're looking at this through the lens of electrophysiology and trying to predict what you would see in terms of the neural dynamics if your understanding of this predictive coding, predictive processing is correct and you're committed to understanding message passing in the brain using this predictive coding scheme.
Güven Güzeldere has raised his hand.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Friston, for kindly agreeing to do this presentation, and my congratulations also to the Cerrahpasa students for organizing this event. So I'm really not an expert on psychoanalysis, so I'll ask a simpler question. And I'll take as my starting point your example. So we see something like a shadow over on the other side of the window. We're not sure if it's a bird or whether it's a leaf. So what do? We move around. We move our eyes and we move our body. And in Helmholtz's terms, we test our hypothesis that, what the outcome of our perceptual system is this or that, whether it's a leaf or a bird. Now, so I wonder how widely we should apply this model to biological beings that don't move around at all. As you know, there are like sea creatures that just stick themselves on top of a rock or something, and then they don't move. And in some instances, human beings, even though they can move their eyes, they can't move their bodies. They have Lockton syndrome or whatever, or they have paralysis of some kind. Does that inability to move around, bodily movement, to what extent does that constrain this hypothesis testing idea?
Well, excellent question. I'm not sure that it constrains the idea, but it certainly foregrounds the importance of being able to move in the spirit of active inference, active sensing, active vision, and also sort of foregrounds the importance of understanding that when it comes to things like locked-in syndromes. But I liked your example of the sea creatures. I think Daniel Walpott often says that initially they can move, but then when they find their perfect position, they eat their own brains because they don't need their brains anymore to move. So that's certainly an interesting example. And an example, I think, which allows you to make a broader point that the same physics of sentience can apply to anything. It can apply to a small particle, it can apply to a thermostat, it can apply to a virus. There are different kinds of natural kinds. There are different natural kinds defined by that Markov-Blanket partition, which would be appropriate to describe this kind of thing or that kind of thing. So sessile things that cannot move don't have any active states, and therefore would be they can still sense in the very simple sense that a rock implicitly can represent the temperature, the ambient temperature of its environments. It can't move, can't do anything about it, but you could argue, not from a psychoanalytic point of view, but from a physicist's point of view, the temperature of the internal states of a rock is in some way representing the ambient temperature of the surface of the rock, which would be its Markov blanket. And then you start to think about the natural kinds that have active states, and those kinds that are sufficiently small can be described purely reflexively. So about viruses and single-celled organisms, they can't plan because they have direct access to the active state, so the active filaments in a cell, for example. So they would be sort of lower forms of life, but they don't do any planning. They don't choose to do this or choose to do that. They just reflexively act in a way that has a high adaptive fitness, or nature has selected using Bayesian model selection. And then we move on to things like you and me that can actually plan ahead at the way that we move. And that's the kind of activation I was trying to describe right at the end, that has this information seeking aspect. So coming back to where you started, I think that's absolutely right. You know, the first thing that we do when confronted with ambiguity and uncertainty is perform an experiment. You know, you and I spend our lives performing experiments, either experiments, you know, in the lab, or asking the right questions in a diagnostic interview with patients, for example. You know, these are ways of querying the world to solicit the kind of data that allows me to disambiguate between different hypotheses. So it could be as simple as looking over there, or it could be a highly detailed diagnostic intervention or blood test, for example. These are all experiments that we perform in order to resolve hypotheses, and we can be compromised. We can be paralyzed. We can have funding withdrawn from our scientific project. You know, there are ways of confounding that epistemic foraging. You know, and you know, hopefully we'll find ways through that. Not always. But it does speak to the importance of being able to query actively the world in a way that sort of allows you to get the right kind of data, the smart data that allows you to optimize your generative models or your world models simply through this notion of resolving uncertainty about different hypotheses. And you could regard this as basically a statement of perhaps not quite Popperian, it's sort of post-Popperian, evidence-based science that's going on in our heads all the time, everywhere, all at once, at different levels. Is that what you were driving at? Is that what you were?
Well, so you said that not being able to move one's body doesn't really constrain, but it foregrounds the importance of action in perception.
Yes.
That's true, but I wonder if there are really no constraints at all. So if, you know, I have locked-in syndrome, let's say I'm lying down on a bed in the hospital, I see something outside the window. I wonder if it's a leaf or a bird. Now, of course, I can move my eyes and, you know, try to minimize my prediction error that way. But I can't really get out of the bed and, you know, go take a look, which is something that I would do if I were able to move. So to that extent, is that not a constraint? That's all I was asking. And to what extent does the lack of action constrain us in perception?
Oh, I see. Well, no, it enormously constrains us, absolutely. And I'm mindful, for example, that if I actually paralyzed your eyes so that you couldn't move your eyes, you know, either microsaccades,
Right.
you would blanch. You'd go blind within about 3 seconds. You wouldn't see
Right.
anything. And there are people who believe that even sort of microsaccades at a sort of gamma, just being able to sort of palpate in the same way that we palpate surfaces with our ridged skin is a sort of micro action that actually elicits the right kind of information that allows us to see in the first place. So at some level, you will be vastly constrained in terms of your perceptual inference if you can't actively sample the world at different levels. Absolutely. And you'll never be able to resolve that uncertainty. You will never know whether it was a bird or a leaf. And indeed,
Right.
Psychophysicists actually exploit that by binocular presentation of, say, houses and faces. You know, they actually get into the weeds in terms of trying to understand the psychophysical mechanisms of this disambiguation by stopping you sampling by looking at the house or the face, by putting a face in one eye and a house in the other, and you can't you try, you see the face, but then that's not good enough for the other eye, so then you see the house and then you flip-flop between them, so you get this sort of ambiguous figure like percepts. So you can easily confound that active vision. Absolutely.
Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
We have such an eager crowd today here, but due to our time limits, this will be our last question coming from Claudia Oval. How this Markov blanket is represented? Is there a neural mechanism that support these calculations and predictions? Can you give us a reference to your papers?
So the Markov blanket, I think it's important to realize that there's not one Markov blanket. There are probably uncountable numbers of different ways of carving up any system into lots of little Markov blankets, and you can have Markov blankets of Markov blankets. So it's a ubiquitous statistical construct which is used in a lot of applications, particularly in computer science, just to limit the message passing amongst neighbors, because you only need to usually communicate within your Markov blanket. As such, it should not don't think there's just one Markov blanket. There are lots of them. For example, if you want to build a deep architecture, say a deep learning architecture, machine learning, or build a brain that has a hierarchical structure, the very hierarchies are defined by Markov blankets. So one level of a hierarchy provides a Markov blanket that separates the level above and the level below. So they're ubiquitous, and I repeat, they exist at all particular scales, both in space and time. So if you want to read about them, if you just Google Markov blankets, and you'll find, I'm sure, some interesting ones. But in terms of their importance in relation to active inference, I think probably the best thing is to get the active inference book by Thomas Parr and Giovanni Pizzulo, which is printed by MIT Press, but I do know it's free. So they've actually made it, you can download the PDF, and that provides a nice intuitive introduction to Markov blankets and everything else that I've been talking about, from a scientific perspective at least.
Thank you, Professor. That was an impressive presentation, and your answers are also. So would you mind me taking a picture? If you could hang on. Thank you so much, Professor. It was such an interesting topic.
Yes, thank you, really.
Well, it's great to speak to you. Thank you very much. I enjoyed our conversation, our questions.
Such an honor for us.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.